We are now being streamed. Thanks for handing the host back. So if you're watching the recording of the live stream, I bet nobody's actually watching the live stream yet, but if you're watching the recording of the live stream, welcome. We will be starting in about 5 minutes. We're just pressing all the buttons to get everything going. You've got an exclusive sneak peek into what happens just before the event starts, which is not very much. We sit and wait. I can play music if you like, or has anybody got a joke they can tell?
If anyone wants to grab a cup of tea or coffee, this is the moment because we still have a few minutes. Oh, by the way, Hen, since at the beginning and yesterday we saw it, a lot of people, well, not a lot, but some people connect unmuted. We might mute them all at 9 a.m. So just so you're attentive to your own mic, that if it goes muted, you can just turn it back on.
Sure.
I think I'm just gonna take out the clock behind me. It's messing with my head, and I'm not liking it. So just give me a second.
Thought it was a halo.
Yeah, I think it's better now. No halos now.
Definitely better.
You can enjoy the portraits, though.
Yeah.
I can't seem to take them down.
No, but they look lovely. They look balanced, and they add interest to your background. But you're right, the clock was looking a little bit weird.
I think if I take the pictures down, the lady of the house would have a word with me. So they stay right up.
No, but they look nice. They add a charm to the background.
I think
Thank
it's good practice to have art around you when you're on screen. I've only got a blank background because I'm between offices at the moment, but I usually try and have some kind of piece of art in my background if I can. Not least because it helps people remember you.
Yeah.
And
something like hands, like the art behind her, right?
Yes.
Like a carpet or something.
Yeah, it gives distinction.
This is only my background because it's the most comfortable place I can sit. It just happens to be back there.
I think this is the most organized we've been at event 5 of 5 of these events. We've finally got to a point where we are completely organized and meditating before the start. I was doing an event for a group on, which day was it? Tuesday. The group used to be called Moral Rearmament, if you remember, if you have your history knowledge. But anyway, they do a thing called quiet time. Just before they start anything, they say, right, we're going to have a moment of quiet time. Allow everybody to meditate for a minute before they start anything. They're now called initiatives of change, and they do all sorts of interesting peace building things. But yeah, I had to look them up. Okay, I think it's time for me to start playing some music and for us to start letting people in.
Good morning. Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome. Hello. Welcome to our last event of the GSR 2023 demand modules on agriculture, renewables in the agriculture sector today. It's really nice to have all of you here. We hope that you also got to be part of our events on buildings, industry, and transport this week. I'm just waiting for a few more people to come in and then we'll get started. I can start sharing my screen and you can let me know if this is all right, Judy.
Yes, that's working. If you can make it full screen, that'd be even better. Perfect.
Is that right?
That's working.
Perfect. All right. So we're here today to talk about renewables in agriculture as part of the GSR demand side modules. We started looking at the demand side of the energy system, just because in the past our GSR was one big report that included everything on renewables, and as changes are happening in the energy sphere, we're starting to listen and see that issues are needed to be addressed in different ways. So to get started, we want to talk about who we are as REN21. It's really important to mention this because who we are really reflects on why we're producing this report. So REN21 is the only global community from industry, NGOs, science and academia, and government working to advance the shift to renewable energy, bringing renewable energy and sector voices together. And it's based on a community of over 4,000 change makers and experts representing overall renewable energy sectors. Our annual publications are probably the world's most comprehensive crowdsourced reports on renewables. We build on crowdsourced knowledge and data used to inform, influence, and shape the dialogue and debates that underpin strategic communication to make renewables the new normal. So this collaboration across the energy sphere is crucial, and that's why we really base all of our reports and all of our work off of these three pillars. And so for people who know REN21 and know the GSR, this is the 18th edition of the GSR that we're currently producing. And it has evolved definitely over the years, both in design and in what we cover. We acknowledge the fact that It's a real collaborative effort, and we are always tapping into our network of experts to push the renewable energy transition and the renewable energy agenda. And so moving to the energy demand modules, this year we have 5 different publications that are coming out across the year. Our first publication on energy demand included modules on buildings, industry, transport, and agriculture. The upcoming modules are on renewable energy supply, energy systems, and infrastructure, economic and social value creation, and how these can be created with renewables, and then a global overview of all things renewables across 2022. And the reason that we're shifting to this new structure is that we really want to talk about all the building blocks of the renewable energy system, because it's not only about supply and it's not only about demand, but it's about bridging both. And we've moved to a modular approach as well, because since we started the first edition of the GSR in 2005 and now, renewable energy has evolved. It's much more systemic. It requires us to look at all the building blocks of the system and look out for how they come together to build the energy system. And so in order to dive deeper into the demand side, we're looking at what changed in 2022 to bring on these responses. So there was a polycrisis that consisted of climate crisis, energy crisis, inflation, all exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Higher prices were impacting all consuming sectors. And so the shift to renewables has been motivated by all of these crises. And this pressing energy, price in energy. Fossil fuels are still dependent on in many communities. It's still a major threat to energy security and access. And however, the shift to renewables has been strongly driven as a solution to this. And so a lot of communities and a lot of countries are looking to shift to cleaner, more secure, affordable, and accessible energy for everyone. In terms of the energy transition, I always say that this is a recurring outcome of the GSR, which is that it's happening, but not fast enough. A lot is happening in power, but not in transport and heating and cooling, for example. And that's where we consume most of our energy. The same thing applies to transport and industry. And with the changing renewable energy supply, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to change demand. And that's one of the main reasons we started strategically looking at the energy demand sectors as well. We can see that across the 4 sectors, uptake is uneven, and fossil fuel dependency is still a major threat. But despite this, we see a growth in all of the sectors by about 4.7% per year on average in the past 10 years. So it is still increasing, just not at the right pace. Another element that we explored in this report was looking at electrification. And here I'd like to highlight especially the transport and agriculture sectors, because although we see a small percentage of electricity in the sectors, they have been the fastest growing in terms of renewable electricity by a growth of 7% or more over the past 10 years. And so looking at the agriculture sector specifically, we can see that agriculture and forestry and aquaculture contributed around 4.3% of the world's gross domestic product. And the agriculture sector employs about a quarter of the global working population, a little more than that. There were main reasons to the shift to renewables in the sector. Those include energy savings, fuel cost reduction, and access to energy. And then in terms of targets and policies, we saw that around 14 countries had targets and policies for renewables in the agriculture sector, However, none of these were regulatory policies obliging the installation or use of renewables. And we'll come to that more when I talk about policies later on. But in terms of technologies, we could see that solar pumping and agrivoltaics were the most popular technologies. And there was a surge in the use of biogas and liquid biofuels in the sector between 2010 and 2020 as well. In terms of shares of renewables in agriculture, they are also gaining more, there is more interest in the uptake of renewables. The share increased between 2010 and 2020 to 15.4%. And within the bioenergy segment, solid biofuels actually fell, the share of solid biofuels fell, and biogas increased, as well as liquid biofuels. Of the total energy used in agriculture, around 73% was in the form of heat. And then when we go into the subsectors, we see that fishing is one of the world's most energy-intensive food production methods, and relies almost completely on fossil fuels. But we can also see that there were some technology developments within the fisheries sector. For example, it was more on the efficiency side, but still a lot of technological developments in gear operations and vessels using LED lighting, for example. And these have brought cost savings to different regions like in Asia, South Africa, and the Caribbean. And so moving on to policies, like I mentioned, there were around 14 countries with fiscal financial policies for renewables, 25 in total, which also includes countries with enabling policies for renewables in agriculture. Those can be programs or standards for agrivoltaics or some sort of investment or fund. And we see that net zero pathways and the push to decarbonize the sector has driven how policies are designed. And so it goes along with energy efficiency measures, especially in food processing and the cold chain. And I'll share some examples of this. But the policies related to renewables in agriculture, they target a lot of technologies, including electricity generation for agricultural processes, solar water pumping, renewable fuels to run agricultural equipment, and renewable heat for food processing and solar thermal energy. Some of the examples we have here from India, for example, in 2022, a net zero target for using diesel in agriculture by 2024 was announced. The goal is to replace diesel generators for pumping and food processing. And there were also other targets that were announced in Bangladesh and the Republic of Korea. I think there were only around 4 countries that we found with targets for renewables in agriculture. And these included the number of solar pumps, for example, or shares of energy, renewable energy. And then we could also see that a lot of subnational jurisdictions were coming up or announcing targets and policies as well. So a few of these examples were in the US and in India as well. And a last example is with electricity. For example, Greece revised its grid distribution to allocate up to 30% of its grid availability to net metering for farmers. And in comparison to other demand sectors, we can see that the push for regulatory policies is still needed in the agriculture sector. So compared to other sectors, there were no regulatory policies that we could find for the use of renewables in agriculture at the moment. And because of the high dependency of fossil fuel in the sector as well, and the rising subsidies for fossil fuels at the moment, which reached $1 trillion for the first time in 2022, we see that there still needs to be a push on this side for other technologies to make their way into the agriculture sector. and be supported by regulatory policies. But as on the positive side, we still have countries that are benefiting from the use of renewables in the context of the agriculture sector. For example, in India, there was an off-grid renewable cooling technology that helped reduce massive post-harvest losses of agricultural products. They allow farmers to expand their markets, reach and gain power in price negotiations, and they're less constrained by time. And so this example specifically was helped to avoid the 40% of food waste that was an actual fact that was happening. And it was also in line with India's target to install 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. So this was in a project in the Mizoram state, and it helped stock up to 10 tons of food. I will end with a call of action here, because I'm hoping that there are a lot of agriculture players that are with us today. And throughout the work on this module with our author and other members of the production, we found that in the agriculture sector specifically, as this is a new topic for REN 21 to explore, but an important one in terms of energy use, there was a challenge in terms of lack of data and coordination. So lack of data generally on energy uses in agriculture and fisheries, and especially for small-scale actors. So it was difficult to track progress in renewable energy adoption and to understand the policy gaps that needed to be filled. And in terms of coordination, the challenge was that the agriculture policies, the sector policies, and energy policies tend to be working in different silos, and there needs to be more coordination and incentives to encourage the adoption of renewables in agriculture in a way that works with the sector as well. And so I'll close at that, and I really call on any agriculture sector players to help us make sure these gaps are filled. We'll move to the panel discussion next. So I'm very happy to have with me experts from different organizations here. We have Manas Pori from the Food and Agriculture Organization, Mohammed Jibril from the Rural Electrification Agency of Nigeria, and Lina Dubina from Solar Power Europe. We'll kick off the panel discussion with a quick poll question, and then we'll start the panel discussion just after we get your responses on that. I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you.
Shall I hit launch?
Yes, please, Judy. So we're asking what the share of renewables is in agriculture. I can see the answers coming in. Some people being more optimistic than others. All right, I think we have about 50% of people who have answered. Okay, and so the correct answer is 15.5%, at least in 2020. And it looks like not everyone is happy with that. Do you think it's much less? Was my presentation that sad, that gloomy? I hope not. No, but I think there is a lot of potential, and yeah, 15.5%, and hopefully getting even higher. So I'll open up the panel discussion, and maybe we can start with the panelists' comments on what you thought about the responses to the poll, just in terms of the 4.1 and 15.5%. I don't know who wants to go first. Do I pick or do you want to go? Manas, you look like you want to. Cool.
Well, I think it shows how limited data we have and how limited sometimes we understand how energy and agriculture are intertwined and how much energy is actually used. And really, the whole discussion of how much renewable energy is used in agriculture is a very recent debate. It's just starting to begin, and I think that's a very positive sign.
Absolutely. Lina or Mohammed, did you want to add to that?
I'll go first. I think I like the fact that there's optimism. What I would say from the sub-Saharan African perspective is you would really see like large-scale energy in agriculture. You'd usually see small off-grid solutions powering agriculture, and they're usually renewable. So I think if we're going to cascade it down to regionals, I think the percentage could even be higher, because there are some regions that really rely on renewables for agriculture, especially biomass, which is really visible in rural areas. I think it's good that people are thinking that percentage is quite high, and we're hoping that it would be even higher.
Yeah, and on my side, I can just echo what the colleagues have already mentioned, that it is a rather new debate, a new approach that we are taking, I think, on a global and also European level. And even though when we are looking at maybe specifically for Europe, as I'm representing a European association, the energy deployment in agricultural fields is becoming more mature markets, but I think it still can be seen that it's not represented in the data or in the communications that we in the media that we put out. So it's still a limited, I think, access to the data, to the information.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And maybe moving on to, because you both started talking about regions and the differences in the developments in regions, maybe you can talk to us a little bit, Lina, about if you found anything that was surprising about the developments of renewables in agriculture in Europe. Was there anything that was of specific notice or highlights that you thought was in response to the energy crisis that came up?
Right. I think when we are looking at Europe in particular, clearly there's been quite a bit of development happening in countries that we were not expecting to have deployment of, specifically if we're speaking about agrivoltaics or agri-solar concept. And it definitely has evolved in the past years. From the data we have and the knowledge we have collected from our members and generally speaking to a wider public, it has been mostly driven by the climate change. So having the different types of events, drastic change in events, having these drought waves, etc., has also made, I think, rather different stakeholders, including farmers, to be more conscious of the different benefits that agrivoltaics can bring. So it's harder for me to maybe answer a bit in terms of the inflation and price rise, but more towards on how the climate change has actually affected the sector and how the renewables can come in and support the local farms or bigger scale farms.
Absolutely. Manas, you're nodding. Did you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree with it. But the energy crisis has generally, I think, had a huge impact on agriculture. I mean, just going by the fact that between 2020 and 21, the prices of natural gas went up by 70%, and more than that, I think 200 something percent. And it actually contributes 70 to 80% to the prices of fertilizer manufacture. So across the board, across the world, what we're seeing now is the prices of inputs like fertilizer going up, partly because of the rises of energy prices. And that is having a huge impact across the world in developed and developing countries. But because of the capacity of developing countries to absorb these shocks is very low, it really has a disproportionate impact on poor farmers and in developing countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can really see the regional differences when it comes to small farmers, especially. Mohammed, did you want to add to what's happening in Africa or in Nigeria specifically? Because there are some developments. I think there is a program that's promoting solar irrigation that has been launched in Nigeria.
Yes,
Right,
there
like
is, and yeah, I think it's just to re-echo the energy crisis. I think the problem you would see mostly in Africa, aside from the rising costs, is actually the lack of access. So with or without the changes in prices, there are places that are actually deprived of electricity. And that means they would either rely on expensive, like natural gas has been spoken of, but diesel as an option. So fossil fuel really being the major instrument for farmers to process their goods. And I think that's the vacuum that the government saw and decided in our own way of our transition, let's just focus renewables on a small scale, multiple solutions in agriculture, so that by the time the transition is actually up, when it is being strengthened, we wouldn't have to go back replacing the solution. So renewables in agriculture has been focused on the government in intervening in different measures. Solar irrigation is one of them, and that's implemented by the REA, but also trying to go back and see how many of these agro-processing zones have had to decommission because they out of energy, or they're lacking energy because of the rising prices, and then seeing how we can incorporate renewables to power them. That has been the focus, especially looking at rural areas where the farming is actually done, and making sure that the processing is done right within the locations. And also to add, I think just recently there's the special agro-processing zones that has been kickstarted, funded by the African Development Bank and some partners, of over $500 million to co-locate these zones within rural areas, thereby bringing like food and agro businesses close to these farmers and having to uptake directly from them. I think all of this is to show that renewables have to be incorporated into the entire value chain for agriculture.
Absolutely. And you spoke a little bit about technologies, and I was wondering if there were like newer technologies that we're starting to hear about, or technological developments for different renewable energy technologies that are coming into the market, because you spoke about off-grid a little bit. And we know, I know, Lina, we can speak to you about agrivoltaics a little bit, but also like in the European context, we see countries like the UK, in contrast to where developments are happening, backing down from agrivoltaics. So do you see different technologies that are going to grow in different contexts? Maybe we can start with you, Lina, and then move to the other panelists.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's already a lot of innovation, research and development has been happening in specifically when we're talking about agri-solar or agrivoltaics concept. And we can see that's going to be evolving in the future even more so, because we still lack quite a bit of data on specific aspects. For instance, what type of crops would be the best suitable for specific PV installation. So I definitely see there's going to be a huge potential and a huge increase in the research and innovation. But that being said, a lot has already been done. So there's already a lot of studies, a lot of pilot projects, demonstrators have been installed for the last 5 to 10 years, and specifically looking at how these different installations can help different types of a crop to provide a better yield. How can they protect from these different types of weather events, whether that's drought, rain, hail, etc. So I'm not going to go maybe particularly in detail of these different types of technologies when we're talking about agri-solar, but I think maybe another thing I wanted to highlight, I think what we also might be seeing more and more coming in in futures, looking at these hybrid projects, so looking how can we store solar, how can we combine agri-PV together with storage systems, for instance, or how can we combine renewable energy technologies like wind and solar that can potentially then sustain farmers or potentially can help agriculture sector with supply of green energy.
Great. Manas or Mohammed, what in your context do you see are other renewable energy technologies penetrating the agriculture sector?
I mean, the way we've been looking at it is through a value chain approach. So we look at the entire sort of the agriculture value chain, right from production, storage, processing, retail, and consumption. So depending on really the end use of energy that is being envisaged, there are multiple plethora of technologies available. So we can, at the production level, we have seen, as you also pointed out, the use of bioenergy largely predominates. So there's a lot of bioenergy used. There's a lot of diesel right now used, fossil fuels being used. But at the same time, you can have decentralized solar power in places where geothermal is available, depending on that. Further down the value chain, for storage, for example, we've seen cases in Nigeria, we've seen cases in Kenya and India, where solar-powered cold storages have been successfully implemented and right now being upscaled. So that's a technology, I think, to really look out for, decentralized solar. But in other cases, like in dairy farms, for example, there's a lot of instances where we've seen the development of biogas that is used to then process a milk where the milk is produced, so you can produce heat through the use of biogas, and the same is used sometimes to offset traditional biomass for cooking. So in terms of what energy technologies are available, I think there are a lot of available. What sometimes is lacking is proper assessment of what kind of technology would be more suitable at what stage and what end use, and what is the total scope of these technologies. So what we generally then recommend is that before developing a policy, one has to look at, be technology neutral, understand what are the sources available in the region or the country, what will it cost to upscale them, and then develop a policy specifically around that results of the assessment. But yeah, I mean, so far what we've been seeing is solar is predominating a lot of the downstream activities in the value chain because it's easy, it's more customizable. As also Lena said there, the agrovoltaics is really scaling up. I mean, we've been working on a project, hopefully in India soon, where they've already done a lot of pilots. And the promise is that it will bring a lot of benefits, both on the agriculture and the energy side. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And from our research, we saw that India is one of the leading countries in renewables and in agriculture, a lot of developments, a lot of support there as well. Mohammed, did you have any examples of where these synergies between food, energy, and climate are happening because of renewables in agriculture?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I think, add into what Manas said around the technology. I would greatly agree that in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where there's vast sunlight, there's that bias towards solar, rightly so. And what we're trying to even do further is looking at, we've already agreed that farming and agricultural activities usually at the first stage of production is usually within these rural areas, and depending on the value chain, we get to come up with a technology that is best suited for it. So for production, for example, we know that we spoke about irrigation systems, so solar, small units of solar irrigation solutions are being deployed massively across farms to allow them to farm all year round. But we're also looking at some biogas gasification, because availability of feedstock within these rural areas allow it to be the least cost option for them. These solutions are taken in a way that they are sustainable. So you have to bring in the private sector. We spoke about pilots here. And for us, government has come in, provide grants, subsidize the solutions. but the end goal is for it to be sustainable even without government. So private sector taking these initiatives and driving it forward and then scaling it. So for it to be sustainable, there has to be profit for the companies, and for there to be profit, it has to be like the least option. So for some places where there's massive farming, we tried a technology, the biogas gasification project, using rice husk as the feedstock for the solution, and it's coming as extremely cheap. That's like the medium for them to buy energy. You can bring your feedstock, the husk that you don't need to purchase energy with it. In some places where there are streams and rivers, we're trying to demonstrate how micro hydro could be used to generate electricity. But we're also taking these off-grid solutions to the processing, where we put mini grids to power processing centers. And we're also looking at standalone solar powered cold storages for perishable goods. I think the attention has now become that it's inevitable to do agriculture without renewables. We can talk about the scale, we can talk about the pace we're taking it, but it has to come at some point. And that's what we've been focusing on, trying to empower these communities. And one thing to point is, if you go to rural communities and you don't power agriculture, you're not empowering the people, because that's like 100% of what they do within these communities. And that's how they can sustain anything you bring. If you bring electricity for social use in their homes, they would have to go back and earn money to purchase units for the electricity. And the only way they could do that is if they are empowered through agriculture, and that's what they do.
Absolutely. I think we're all in agreement with that. Maybe I'll follow up with a question of, how do you think we can scale it up? Because it's already there, it's happening, but just like we said, it's not fast enough, the pace.
I'll take a stab at this, and I think pilots are being done, and there's a lot of demonstrations out there. Yes, we have this debate, and at the risk of being the lone voice in this conversation, a lot of solutions require subsidies to be demonstrated. But I think we have to start thinking subsidies would not be present like in the long run. So we have to, while doing these demonstrations, also try to see how does this solutions, how does this intervention go beyond subsidies, and how do we bring in the private sector to own this? How do these investments come in and take over, and companies are just able to come in, private investment is going to come in and take over this. And that's why we've been trying this public-private partnerships, where government come in, but just to de-risk the space. But as long as there is no risk, then there's no subsidies. An example I'll give you is, if we go to a rural community and we wanted to provide a mini grid, ordinarily a private company would want to go to an urban area where people are more in need of electricity and deploy and put up some tariff for them and collect money. But if you tell them to go to a rural area where they are not largely dependent on electricity, you have to motivate them, you have to de-risk the space for them. But then compared to places where there is actually productive use, so if you go to a processing center, the motivation is, look, this is already a win-win for you. You're gonna get money whether we subsidize it or not. So we have to put that context, and I'm talking about rural context now, and some of these solutions we've been trying to test. But for it to be scaled, I think we have to start looking at bringing in private companies with private investments to come and own these solutions.
That's a great stab at the answer. Manas, did you want to add to that?
I think Mohammed really hit the nail on its head. I think that's very important. You have to bring in, subsidies are not sustainable. We've learned that in the past many years. So if there are targeted subsidies where it's actually trying to solve a problem, and then there's an exit strategy, often called as smart subsidies, they seem to work better, but just subsidies often distort the market, and in the long run actually makes things very difficult. Just to complement what Mohammed was saying, in addition to, I think, private sector, one has to also focus on building technical capacity around the technology, which is often lacking. Because one has to understand, I mean, for farmers, if the technology is introduced and then the private sector or the government, whoever leaves, and even if there is a slightest of the problem, farmers lose trust in that technology very quickly if they can't fix it quick enough. So one has to have an ecosystem around it, a support system around the technology that enables the farmers to actually build trust in it. And then on top of that, along with the private sector, the ecosystem, there has to be also awareness and acceptance. There's no acceptance of the technology without awareness. So a lot of the time we have the technologies like biogas systems, for example, have been existing for a very long time. But we've seen so many bad examples sometimes where it works until the project is being implemented. And as soon as the project ends, the biosystem stops working and then people lose trust in it. Then it becomes very difficult to scale up because often in the communities, it's the word of mouth that builds trust. So if somebody somewhere, even in the neighboring village, knows that 200 kilometers away there was a farmer where the biogas system or a specific technology did not work, then it's very difficult to convince them to invest in it. So there's some of the hard facts, but also some of the soft social understanding that needs to go with it.
Lina, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but I also wanted to ask you about incentives and governmental support schemes, because we talked about subsidies as well, and they seem to be very popular amongst policies in the sector, but are they enough when they're not also like combined with regulatory policies and also coordinated with sector policies, so renewable energy policies and sector policies working hand in hand?
Yeah, indeed. And I think it's a good question. Again, I'll be just focusing a bit more on European context, as that's where we are mostly working on. Yeah, you have rightfully said that there's quite a bit of incentives, and these governmental subsidies have been becoming a more of a stable income for the deploying of agrivoltaics, and there's a lot of different governmental frameworks that they put forward for these financial support schemes. However, what we see on a European context, but also on the national levels across the different member states, there's no regulatory framework when it comes to agrivoltaics. Not one to this day has been implemented that specifically will look at, for instance, how to even define agrivoltaics. So what is the definition? What is the criteria to define it? How do we assess the different types of projects? Or even looking at CAP subsidies, which is the Common Agricultural Policy subsidies that are being granted to the European farmers to continue their agricultural activity on the land. But there's still unclarity in terms of whether these CAP subsidies could also be given to the different farmers who deploy agrivoltaics. So where they do continue their agricultural activity, and on top of that, they also have the PV systems. And this is still varies across the different member states and still doesn't give does not give really the incentives for the farmers to also deploy agrivoltaics in the future or roll out more agrivoltaic projects because of these uncertainties when it comes to the regulations, policies, etc. And also looking at more European context, there's a bit of different things are happening across different member state countries, but there's no harmonized approach that we can take and implement on European level. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of barriers when we're talking about agrivoltaics and the deployment in Europe, even though we can see that the markets have matured and there's a lot of business models have been deployed. And when we're looking at the PV developers, they know what they're doing. They already have the business plan. But I think it comes from the governmental, European and national level, where we need the strength and support.
Absolutely. And just going back to what Manas was speaking about earlier as well, do you feel like in Europe you have the same situation in terms of the lacking of skills, or do you feel like this is becoming more popular and less of a challenge?
Yeah, I think again depends if you already have a lot of these developers that have employ the business model where they have the necessary skills on how to work with these agrivoltaic projects. But again, we're looking into innovation. So there's going to be a new innovative projects coming out, and new skills might have been needed depending on what the results from these research studies or these pilot projects come out with. So I think there's definitely going to be a need in certain skills, especially when we want to combine the synergy between agriculture and solar energy or renewable energy. And this is also that we as a Solar Power Europe Association are going to be looking more into on what types of job creations are we looking in the future, what types of skills we're going to be needing, whether technical or social skills, etc. Yeah, so it's a bit hard to answer specifically, more specifically, but I think definitely something we'll be needing to look into in the future.
Great. I guess before we move to the Q&A, I'll ask a last question for all the panelists, and it's more about future development and how you see this for the end use, from the end use perspective. So for farmers being able to increase their incomes through the use of renewable energy technologies and the different production processes. Manasi talked about deployment across the supply chain. And do you have examples of where this is already happening or where there are best practices that other contexts can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, providing cheap energy, for example, to farmers directly increases profits because it's a cost that is being minimized, right? But on top of that, in terms of energy, for example, we have cases on bioenergy in South Asia and East Africa, where we developed a system where farmers, in addition to selling crops, can also sell extra residues to private companies who then use briquettes or pellets that can be sold as cooking fuels, or as Mohammed was saying, can be used to produce biogas that can then be supplied back to the farmers for cooking or for processing. So sometimes in bioenergy, for example, there are cases where it can definitely increase incomes, because then instead of one, you're selling two different products from the same field. You're selling the food crop, but also some of the residues that are produced. From agrovoltaics, this is also the whole idea. I think one of the, at least, components of it, the idea would be then farmers can be producers of both food and energy. So in countries where there is feed-in tariffs available, the farmer can sell food, increase yield, hopefully through it, and then also sell the extra excess energy back to the grid. So you diversify your income, and for farmers, it can mean a lot. Also further down the value chain, for example, in cases where you have rice milling systems, for example, rice mills, they need electricity, but one of the byproduct of rice is the rice husk that can be used to produce electricity that can be attached to a rice mill. So instead of buying energy from the grid, one can use that energy, supply it back to the rice mills, and then reduce overall costs. The same can be done with sugarcane bagasse in sugarcane mills. So there are examples. The challenge there is always is that sometimes these examples look very lucrative, but one has to really do a techno-economic assessment if they are profitable under a certain set of scenarios, which are very local. So if a rice milling system that is producing electricity from rice husks in South Asia is profitable, doesn't mean it might be profitable in East Africa or South Africa, or vice versa. You know, sometimes it boils down to just the policy. If there are no feed-in tariffs, like we were recently working in Turkey, there were no feed-in tariffs at that point. So then this solution becomes unviable. You know, and then you have to sort of come up with a system where you have these policies that can enable the offtake of these systems.
Mohammed, did you want to add to that? Do you have any other examples?
Yes, I think for us is looking at the value chain, understanding where the benefit would come to the farmers, and largely how it enhances, like, for example, food security. Looking at production, if you really want to help the farmers in production, is providing, for example, Manas was speaking about rice farming and rice milling. We understood that they needed irrigation systems for them to farm. Usually rice farms are located close to water, but then there is also the need to pump this water and spread it across. So what we decided to do in REA back in Nigeria, aside from the usual mandate that we have, providing electricity, cutting the access, lack of access, focusing on the rural areas, the underserved areas, the unserved areas. And we decided to say, how do we impact their lives beyond just electricity for electricity's sake? Where do they need it the most? And then we took this diversion, focusing on agriculture. One of them is the off-grid solutions targeting irrigation systems, small pumps, solar powered, really small, 2 kilowatt to 5 kilowatts, cascaded. And then coming back to processing, of course, there's the lack of access. So when they produce, there's that, where do they take it to? How do they process it? And mostly you would see that when they're doing manual milling, they don't get to sell the rice really properly. There's no, they don't get to sell it like with a good cost. So most of the equipment they use, even when they're using electricity, are not efficient. And the I think a perfect example is the grain of the rice coming out broken, and then people buying it would say, no, we have to buy it for a cut price and so on. So what we're trying to do is providing and testing some of this efficient, low voltage consuming equipment to substitute the old and like really muscular rice mills within the mini grid sites that we have already deployed. And that solves the problem for us in the efficiency of the equipment, also minimizing the use of electricity, spreading it all over. And then going to cold storage. I think the biggest problem we've seen and what we've tried to do is in all of our mini grid sites, we're trying to test providing solar powered cold storages, because there's a lot of perishable goods, dairy products requiring that additional shelf life before people come to uptake, and access to market as well. Is it electrical vehicles that we could use that we utilize the mini grids within the community? Essentially, I think for the communities to benefit and for these solutions to be sustained, we try to look at the presence of a mini grid in the community and what everything we can plug in so that their lives are bettered. Like I said, around irrigation, of course, irrigations are not mini grid powered, they're standalones, but right from the processing, powering this rice mills, for example, providing the equipments that are more efficient, to attaching some cold storages within the mini grid, and also ensuring that these companies that are there are also advertising or are bringing in larger companies to come and buy and aggregate from these local farmers. And also something we've tried to do with like Farmers Association is we understood access to market is a problem for some of these farmers. They could farm as much as possible. If somebody doesn't come and buy them, it becomes a burden for them. What we try to do is, how do they pay for electricity with the produce that they have? So instead of having to wait to sell this produce, they tend to, some of the developers, mini grid developers providing electricity for the processing, tends to just uptake and take the grain of them and take it as a form of payment. We're trying to see if that could solve the problem before the markets arrive at these local locations. And that's something we're still experimenting. But yeah, largely at the end of the day, we want to see that the communities are bettered, and we're seeing the impact across the food security problems that we're facing. How does all of this combine to affect the food security, and how is the economic of the communities, the rural communities, also improving?
Absolutely. Lina, did you have any examples from Europe? And Mohammed also touched a little bit upon like the use of transport. So if you have any examples also of like cross-sectoral, how these developments can help farmers.
Right. Maybe it's a bit harder for me to give exact examples, but this is exactly what we've seen when we're working these agrivoltaic PV projects, is where the farmers do get a higher increase of the revenue, whether that's from the increase of the crop production or whether that's for the green energy that they get to either use up for their agricultural activities, as already been mentioned before, for instance, providing the electricity for.
We collectively undermine ourselves.
I'm sorry, I think I can hear something.
Sorry, they're muted now.
Right, no, really, no worries. Yeah, so I was just saying, so whether using that energy they produced on the field, to either use it to use that energy for the machineries, for any other type of agriculture, where they use the energy in their agriculture production, or being able to sell it, put it into the grid and get the revenue from the energy that they produced. So there's a lot of different benefits that we've already seen for the farmers, and we've also seen that, for instance, you can get an increase to around 30% if you can also couple the revenues that you can get from selling, for instance, PV energy, and along with them coming also the subsidies that you can get from the governmental state aid. So it's a bit, yeah, I can't give us specific examples, but this is exactly what we see in when we deploy these agrivoltaic projects.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think this is a good segue to the Q&A. So I'll ask the participants to, if you have any questions, raise your hand and we can bring you up here to ask your questions, or you can send them in the chat. I already see there are a couple of questions in the chat we can start with. So one is, have you noticed any resistance to change when implementing renewable projects for agriculture? And how has this been addressed? I'm not sure if there are any takers for that one. So resistance to change and how it's been addressed. Go ahead, Manas.
Yeah, maybe I can have a go at it. Resistance, I think, not directly resistance, but often sometimes I've seen that technologies are not planned around social context. So for example, for cooking fuels, we always sometimes see that even when you introduce modern cooking fuels, people actually go back to using a 3-stone fire because they just say, I don't like the taste, you know, of when you cook it on a modern nuke because they're used to it. So I think sometimes these change can take a long time because of people's preferences that are very local. So that is something that I've seen, and I was like, that was a real learning experience for me. So maybe that is something that one has to think of.
Mm-hmm. There's another question from Obina. Sorry, Mohammed, did you want to add to that before we take another question?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, not really like a challenge as well, not really resistance, but usually when you put renewables in agriculture and you want it to be sustained, like I said earlier, you have to bring some private participation, and that would mean people participating and paying for services. I think the biggest challenge we're saying is that willingness to participate. So people are more comfortable using their old methods. So when you bring in electricity and you want it to provide equipment, and the first instinct would be, okay, would it be free? Because we're not paying for anything now, we're doing it manually. And if you say no, you have to pay for it. I think that awareness that we keep doing, trying to educate them, trying to show them how using electricity would mean better output and better product and the better income is the challenge for us, having to educate and make people aware that renewable is actually electricity generally would actually help them. I think that's like the challenge and the resistance we've seen in some of the projects that we've done.
Lina, did you have something to add to the challenges?
Right. I think maybe when we're also looking a bit on the European context, again, as already mentioned many times, it is a mature market and it is evolving even more in other countries across the globe. I think what we see in the European context is also having a bit more resistance from the farmers themselves, especially when looking at the large scale farms. And I think this also needs to be addressed more in collaboration of the different PV industries, policy makers. So having a sort of cross-sectoral discussions across these different stakeholders to understand, so what are the risks, what are the potentials, what are the needs of these different stakeholders, and how can we collaborate the best way possible across, so everyone gets the benefits that we are looking for. So I think maybe one of the sort of bigger issues on the European context would be having the trust coming from the farmers as well. Because I think, as already been mentioned by Manas, for instance, beforehand, having this, technological reliability, having the governmental policy frameworks put in place. So there's a lot of things that still need to be put into the force. So I think to having this credibility of agrivoltaic projects even more, and having this trust from the farmers to implement and work with these projects.
Great. I think that answers the question comprehensively. Thank you. We have a question from Abina. Abina, would you like to unmute yourself so we can hear your question?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, all. Yes, my question borders on how to get local peasant farmers to benefit from renewables in agriculture. The land ownership system in, for example, in Eastern Nigeria is owned by families. So to do a mini scale or a big scale of irrigation would be a problem. So you need to get agreement from individual families to do that. Individual families own land and they farm mainly recently. So to deploy renewable in agriculture is a big challenge. So one plot, next plot doing, for example, a small irrigation for dry season life farming would be a challenge in terms of who pays for it. So then again, government in Nigeria, they are trying, and I think Jubril have highlighted some of them. The federal governments are doing well to support agricultural businesses by deploying solar to them to construct irrigation. But we are looking at peasant farmers that are about 60 to 70% of real farmers in Nigeria. So how do we get to that kind of level of peasant farmers to encourage them to benefit from renewables in agriculture? And then there's a case in point. I have 2 friends here that owns fish business, in a small scale, in a plot or 2. They have like 6,000 fishes there. And he has been asking me that the greatest problem he has is pumping water for the fish farm. And then he spends hundreds of thousands in a week to buy diesel to do that. And I told him that solar would be good, but he said how much? I costed it for him. To start with, he'll be looking at, if it's not pumping in the night, he can do like 2 or something million. So but that would be a big money for him to put down for me to deploy for him. So we are looking at how can he pay instrumentally. So these are challenges. Peasant farmers can't afford that. That's the truth. So if there's a way government can, work with them, maybe through cooperatives, they can deploy this into them and they'll pay much more until they own it. It will help. Now, apart from irrigation and cooling, there's also an aspect for fish farmers that have to do with drying the fish. So these are opportunities that when we look at it and see how we can bring in peasant farmers to benefit, it will drive this enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Abina. I think this echoes a lot of what Manas was talking about deployment in different parts of the supply chain. And I don't know if you had, I couldn't hear very properly, so I don't know if you had a specific question that you want us to address, or if you can write that in the chat, it will be much clearer for us to address. That would be great.
Yeah, thanks. My question is, how do we get peasant farmers to benefit from renewable in agriculture, given the high cost?
All right. So how do you get farmers to benefit from renewables given the high costs? High cost of fossil fuels we're talking about.
I can have a go.
Go ahead.
I mean, one of the clearest ways that governments respond to it is by subsidizing it. Generally in the long term, I don't think it can have negative or positive impact. That's up for discussion. But in the short term, I think one of the strategies would be to leapfrog to some better renewable energy technologies. And that's what the idea would be, that for things, for at least for end users where there's very limited access to energy anyway, or if completely dependent on fossil fuels like diesel generators for pumping, as Mohammed has said, in those cases, it can also offer what the current crisis can be an opportunity to leapfrog to technologies and use the money that would normally might be spent in subsidizing fossil fuels to subsidize or at least kickstart a renewable energy industry in agriculture. In some cases, it has worked. There is evidence. For example, solar pumping started with a bit of subsidy, but in many countries, those subsidy was slowly removed and they're gone now. So it could be a way, opportunity also to expand the use of renewable energy across the value chain. I'm not sure if I answered the question correctly, but that's what I understood.
So Abina has sent a clarification, and he's wondering how farmers can benefit from renewables in agriculture given high capex. So I misheard the question.
Well, that's a major challenge, high capex. But there are two things. Again, you can have a regulatory policy around it, but I think the role of private sector there becomes very important, because instead of technological innovation, we also need business model innovation. So how can we come up with new business models that will minimize the cost for the farmer? And in some cases, at least, something like pay-as-you-go systems for solar cold storages in East Africa and India have worked. So a farmer pays only a few cents, for example, depending on the number of crates of perishables that they store. And nobody actually buys the cold storage. The company installs the cold storage and provides cooling as a service almost. So you pay for the amount of time you use it and for the quantity of perishables that you save in it, store in it. So to make it affordable, I think it might take some time, but I think a lot of the business model innovation would need to come in to make that happen.
Thank you, Manas. I hope that answers your question, Abina. We have another question, maybe for Mohammed. Karishma is asking if your experience in urban or peri-urban areas has been different than in rural areas.
Yeah, I was thinking it was meant for me. So generally, if we talk about electricity, and like I said earlier, there is that tendency for private companies to move towards peri-urban areas. And the policy within some of the countries in Africa is, especially in Nigeria, is you can set up a power facility or utility and just sell electricity based on some guidelines provided. But for you to be profitable, you probably would have to look towards the urban areas where people really depend on electricity. And that's why, for us, the government said, okay, we're going to come up with an agency that is focused mainly on rural areas. And when we came up and we said, okay, private companies are not comfortable going into rural areas because they deem it not viable, the conversation around subsidies now came in. Okay, we're going to subsidize, we're going to do a public-private partnership. The government comes in and provides some subsidy. The private company comes in and provide equity and then own the infrastructure. And like Manas said, provide electricity as a pay-as-you-go. So you get like a meter. You don't own the infrastructure in the village. And the private company becomes the utility owner in the community, and then you get to pay for the units that you consume. So that's how we were able to go into the rural areas. But I think the main catch here is that there's tendency for private companies to go towards the urban areas and towards where there is, and also towards where there is productive use. So economic clusters where there are shops, people go to markets and they sell goods, and they definitely need electricity to manage their goods. People at home in rural communities would decide, you know what, I'm not going to pay for electricity for the next 1 week. I'm just going to use my local methods, the hand fan and everything, get cool until I have money to pay for it. So for developers, peri-urban areas tend to make them more profitable. and also places where there's productive use, like I said, economic clusters, shopping malls, markets, also attracting investments. And that's why we're focused on providing some of the subsidies now. World Bank, African Development Bank, all chipping in to say, okay, how do we keep subsidizing this until when the space is actually mature for private companies to take over? I think that's the visible difference that I've seen in terms of the difference between the rural and urban areas.
Lena, do you see more or less the same differences in Europe, or is it a little, is there a change?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
I was wondering if you also see the same differences between urban and rural deployment, or if it's if there isn't that much of a difference, or the same sort of differences.
Yeah, I think in European context, it's a bit different also depending on what aspects are we looking at, but it's way more, obviously it's way more developed and more integrated to be deploying in urban areas, so to deploy different types of PV rather in rural areas because of the different issues that we already discussed. And there's also more, I think when you're talking on governmental aspects, there are more incentives in terms of not only incentives, but also in terms of the regulations. So permitting procedures, etc., are way more faster, swifter. So there's more easier access to deploy PV in urban areas rather than looking at the rural areas. Yeah, so it's so there's a bit of a change a bit of a difference when we're looking on a European context.
Mm-hmm. I'll stay with you and ask another question from the chat as well. And someone is asking if you see an increase in the price of land due to energy production with agrivoltaics. We haven't touched on land use so far, so thank you for that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, so just to give one example where we saw the increase in price in the land change was, or in the land use, was specifically in Germany, where they, if they were to deploy these agrivoltaic projects on a farmland, the land would then automatically change the classification scheme and would be classified as industrial area. And that would then mean that they would have to pay a higher tax for the land rather than having the farmland tax that they would normally be paying. As far as I know, this on a national, regional, local level, this issue has already been resolved in terms of different policies that they've implemented in Germany. But this doesn't mean that the same issue might rise in other countries, for instance, like more Central Eastern countries where agrivoltaics is not as permanent, not as evolved as in looking at the Western countries. So definitely something that needs to be considered and taken into consideration. This is something also we as an association are now working on and looking on how these agrivoltaic projects are evolving across the different member states, but also looking at what is the state of the play when we're looking at the policy regulations, what are the challenges in terms of the cost per land, how does government react when we do put these agrivoltaic plants on the ground, specifically if it's a farmland, and whether that would then change also this classification scheme, etc. So there's a lot of components that need to be assessed, and it really goes down to the nitty-gritty details of national, regional, and local policies and how they react to these implementations.
I don't know if anyone wants to add to that. Otherwise, we can go to another poll question. Manas or Mohammed? Nothing on land use?
So I think yeah, I think I would agree with Lena. To some extent, the context is different. In Nigeria, for example, land for mini grids. Communities tend to understand that there's a benefit coming to them, and it actually sometimes goes free to the private developer. Sometimes the developers are required to purchase lands to situate their businesses. But I think one visible I think note is that the more you provide renewables, the more people are going back into farming. and that it tends to spike the land. I think Obina spoke about some owners in the southeast where the community or people own their lands, and sometimes it even brings conflicts where people are now focusing more on agriculture, and then there are some certain interests coming in trying to utilize this land because there's this intervention coming in. So yeah, largely depending on the land use, there could be some competition and there could be some rise in the interests for the use of the land. Just trying to equate to what we've been able to see recently. I hope this adds to the conversation.
Thank you, Mohammed. Manas, did you want to close that up with a...
No, I mean, just to agree with both, because with land tenure and land use, it really boils down to the policies and the way the laws are written about how the land could be used. So it can be a very contentious issue in some contexts and not a lot in the other context. But I think one of the reasons why the whole idea of also the agrivoltaics came in was to maybe use the land for both the things and avoid that kind of competition. So that seems to be scaling up. At least policymakers in different countries that we've been in touch with, they are very pro agrivoltaic. One of the reasons is because it allows the same piece of land to be used for two purposes. So, but again, I mean, this was also the debate for bioenergy many years ago, food versus fuel. So is the same land being used to produce energy or food? But I think since then we've sort of evolved and there's more of a consensus on how this should be taken forward.
Thank you. All right, so we'll launch a second poll just to get some answers from the participants here on the share of renewable electricity in agriculture. Is this going to be in line with the first poll answer? Let's see. Okay, a lot less people going for the lower percentage now. So the panel have convinced everyone that agricultures are going in the right way, renewables in agriculture. All right, and the correct answer is 9%. So great job, panelists. Thank you for listening. All right. I don't know if there are any more questions from our participants. If not, okay, we have one more question here. So what policies that are already in place would you highlight, if any, that have truly prompted the use of renewables in agriculture? I think you've mentioned some already, but were there any highlights?
I mean, the one that you already mentioned in your presentation was, like, for example, India trying to completely not use diesel in agriculture by 2024, which is next year. Though that kind of demand-driven policies really do make an impact, rather than subsidies. So setting targets, the problem is always with policies that energy policies and agriculture policies, they often don't talk to each other. They develop silos, and that is a problem because sometimes you go to the Ministry of Energy and talk about even agrivoltaics or energy for agriculture, and they would ask you to go to the Ministry of Agriculture. And if you go to the Ministry of Agriculture, they sometimes direct you to the Ministry of Energy, saying that it's an energy issue. So that needs a little bit more. So normally, developing technical working groups, cross-ministerial groups, we've seen that really helps in developing common vision of what energy use and agriculture should be in the future.
So there are good things happening, but we still need that coordination. And someone else is asking if there are some good case studies about successfully getting landowners on board. So cross-cultural comparison. Do you have any ideas of where these might exist. I know we're trying to find more case studies to highlight in the GSR, so that would be something to look at as well. But nothing that I personally know of now. Any of the panelists? Not at the moment. There's a question. I think we missed this question. Thank you for sending it again. Is there any work regarding the development of policies in Nigeria regarding more integration of renewable energy in agriculture? I think that one's for you, Mohammed.
Yeah, it is. So generally, I think I wouldn't want to preempt, but the policies allow the government and private players to go into renewables. One clear example I think that I know is providing like tax relief for renewables. It's not really in agriculture, but it's a venture that we've been on trying to see that the taxes or the import duties attached to renewables have been taken out just to encourage people to bring it. There's been a back and forth, and the case study we provided then was because of the levy, most private companies are not able to deploy as much as they could, and the tariff for electricity is going really high from renewables, and we had pushed so much, and I think there was a pilot for it to be tried for a few years, and even now there's this selective. So for agriculture, for example, the Rural Electrification Agency where I work could say the Energizing Agriculture Program is targeting these goals and these objectives, and therefore it requires to be declared as an emergency project, which would attract some of these benefits, such as the tax waivers for private companies that are buying in solar panels and inverters and batteries and so on. This is something that has been played around with, not really a policy, I would say, but it's been tried on a case-by-case basis. But generally, the act that established the REA also is a policy that says private developers can come, work with the government, get the subsidies that they want, and go to any open space and provide electricity. There was a certain challenge from utility companies providing grid electricity, saying, okay, this is our catchment area, but the government was clear and direct in saying the people enjoying this electricity could decide where they get electricity from. So if you want to set up a company, if it is under 1 megawatt, then just go ahead, do it. We're gonna come look at the appliances you're using, look at standards and specification, and if it checks, then you're able to sell electricity whoever you are. I think this tiny policies here and there encourages people to go into renewables, not just for agriculture, but generally, but agriculture also being in the mix. This is me struggling to answer questions really directly directed at policies, but I hope this helps.
I think that's that is very helpful. All right, we're getting closer to the end of the session, so I'll ask a question that all the panelists can reply to, and maybe add to that some of your closing remarks. So it's a little broad, but so we want to know how you see the role of renewables in agriculture and the agriculture sector evolving, in terms of like, what's the big dream, what do you want to see, and what's the nightmare, what should we avoid? So Lina, maybe you want to go first. And then you can give us some of your closing remarks about today's session.
Right, it's a big question, a lot to comprehend while like giving the answer. So I think when we're talking from the solar industry in particular, and I think what we see as a big dream is just having these synergies that we are working on, that we see in these pilot demonstrator projects that we rolled out, to see being implemented not only on European context, but also on a global level. So seeing that we can synergize the sustainability aspect, so looking at social economic aspects, looking at environmental benefits, looking on how can we actually provide this food security. And at the end of the day, I think how can we decarbonize the sector and allow it to go towards the climate neutrality. So I think just seeing how we can escalate and evolve these projects and see them across the globe, not only on European level, and just having them developed even further. Also looking at on smaller countries and context of, like, for instance, islands where the grid connections are different, where there's more self-consumption needed, etc. So I think that would be sort of, from the solar perspective, a big dream is just seeing that we can provide green energy to the farmers, and that's being easily accessible and also feasible in terms of economic aspects.
Great. And what should we avoid?
Ooh, that's also a bit of a tough question, I think, to answer.
Should we avoid continuing to subsidize fossil fuels?
One of them, I think that's already sort of tailored into my answer to the what is the big dream.
Absolutely.
Right. But I think just maybe looking again more on a very not a pragmatic, more practical perspectives, just being able to having these cross-sectoral discussions, having these cross-sectoral policies implemented so we can support the development of different renewable energies in the agriculture sector. So not only looking at the agri-solar, but looking also at the other different types of technologies that we have for renewables. So just, yeah, having this shared vision, shared collaborative work towards it, and being able to roll out these projects more swiftly and more easily.
Thank you, Lena. Manas, did you want to tell us your dream for renewables and agriculture?
Well, the dream would be really to de-link agriculture production from fossil fuel use. So to really avoid the shocks that agriculture always gets when there is a problem like what we're facing today. Because then for many of the developed countries or countries that have the monetary sort of policies in place to absorb that shock, many of the developing countries don't, and they really get impacted by it. So if we can de-link that from the shocks in the oil market or the fossil fuel market, that would already be fantastic. And really the only way to do it to increase the use of renewables in the agriculture sector. And the dream would be then also that the agriculture sector uses renewable energy in such a way that's sustainable environmentally, climate-wise, but also socially in a way that can increase then farmer income. So if renewable energy can make farmers entrepreneurs finally, rather than subsistence level farmers, but they can operate as proper business, then that would be fantastic.
Mohammed, on to you.
Yeah, I think I'm struggling to capture and caption the dream, like you said, but just to put this in a better context, imagine a country like Nigeria with over 200 million people and about 47% of them considered rural. About 27% of that rural Nigeria has access to electricity, grid or not. Also, every rural community in Nigeria carry out a form of agriculture. It could be rice farming in some areas where there's water. It could be cocoa farming in some dry areas and so on. And I hope I get this right, about 75% of Nigeria's land area is considered as agricultural land. And most of the food consumed is largely produced by small-scale farmers, which is then aggregated by large-scale processors. I think just looking at that, you would understand that lack of access means grid electricity is not going to go to these rural areas anytime soon. And there's a need for off-grid electricity, renewables to go into these locations to enable them be like Manas said, entrepreneurs, not just farmers. And how do you do that? You have to employ the solar, the biogas, the hydros at that small scale in different locations to enable people sustain their livelihood. So I think it's not a question of whether it's needed or not. It's the question of, are we going fast enough or not? And I feel like renewable is the way to help people become like regular, meaningful people, like businessmen, like you said, sustain their lives. It also helps businesses within the urban areas, the companies, to go in and make profit doing it. It also helps the country in securing their food security at the end of the day. Looking at it from all the angles, I think it speaks to just hastening taking renewables into agriculture. The scale is questionable, but the technology, I think, has been decided for us a long time ago. This is again me struggling to just say this right.
No, that's great. You got a thumbs up from the audience as well. So I think everyone's happy with that answer. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you very much to the panelists. I'd like to just finish off on like the key takeaways that we took out of this session, which we talked about climate change as a key driver, along with inflation and energy prices impacting inputs for agriculture. So it's affecting both developed and developing countries. We spoke about renewable energy for access that's used in agriculture and diversifying income as well. And the last thing I think that we were all in agreement on was the need for sectoral and regulatory policies to increase and be more coordinated. So thank you again all for being here. Last thing is I'd like to invite everyone to explore the publication. My colleagues have sent the link to the GSR demand modules in the chat. So you can check these out and keep an eye out for our upcoming modules as well, coming out throughout the year. So through May and June. Those are going to be on renewables, energy and supply, energy systems and infrastructure for renewables, economic and social value creation with renewables, and the global overview in June. Thank you so much, everyone.
Can you share the link again, please? I was a little bit late.
No worries. We'll share it right now.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariella. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for organizing. Brilliant discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.